Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Liberty Solutions 3.0. I'm Mary Ruart, uh, chair of Liberty International, and I'm going to introduce your speaker today. I hope that you did get a chance to listen to my audio, how Liberty gives Judeo-Christians what they want, as sort of a prelude to our speaker today. If you listen to that recording, you realize that I took some basics. It's not something that you're going to get the fullness of talking to Christians about. But today's speaker, Michael Severance, is going to really get in a little deeper with you. And the reason, of course, is we want to do a deep dive into issues and groups that libertarians have difficulty in speaking with. And Michael's a very good person to be introducing this because he has studied extensively. He has a BA in philosophy and humane letters from the University of San Francisco. He's been at the St. Ignatius Institute, Great Books program, and he is currently actually in Rome, and he works with the Acton Institute, which is a Catholic-based nonprofit that is very much into economic freedom. And I think he's going to be telling you a little bit about that today. So I'm really excited to hear what he has to say myself, because, of course, as you know from my earlier talks, I do come from a Catholic background. And I want you to be able to help people understand that the libertarian philosophy is very much attuned to the ethics of Christianity. So without very much more ado, I am going to turn the microphone over to Michael, and I will be here, and I'll be listening too, because I want to hear what he has to say.
Oh, good. Everyone can hear me okay, correct?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Hello, everybody. I don't know how many friends of freedom we have online with us, but I welcome all of you very warmly from the eternal city of Rome. I've been here for some 23 years. I've actually spent almost most of my human life in Rome, then back home, which is Arizona, from Phoenix, Arizona. So anyways, just before we get into the details of the intellectual conversation, it's only fair that I share some of my own personal history and who I am. And where I work and where I come from. These are some basic things everyone should know. So I'm Michael Severance. I direct the Acton Institute's office in Rome. Acton Institute is a think tank based out of the city of Grand Rapids in Michigan, founded in the early 90s by a priest and a layman with a common shared belief for personal freedom. Very simple. That's the same thing we have in common. The basic value of being free and to avoid coercion on various levels of the state, of the economy, of any type of superpower that tries to impose its force over a free-willed human existence. So I've been here in Rome for 23 years. I've been directing the Institute for about 4 years now. But I've been working for Acton for about 17 total years, originally as a manager of international operations, and I was promoted to the direction of the office about 4 years ago, just before COVID. So anyways, a few more words about Acton. By definition, we're a religious think tank. We often forget that ourselves at Acton. We're not necessarily a Christian think tank, even though my task today is to defend Christianity as compatible with libertarianism as a basis for freedom. But at Acton, we like to think of ourselves as just very generally a religious think tank. It's a think tank whose advocacy is to promote a free and virtuous society, and one which is characterized by individual liberty or personal liberty and sustained by religious principles. So we're pretty vague. Even here in Rome, people think that we're a Catholic institution, but we're truly not. We're just a religious think tank. And at Acton, of course, that means that we embrace all faith traditions, but we're particularly interested in faith traditions. We really are. And we're not what we would call syncretists. We're not the kind of like faith shoppers who like to go and pick and choose whatever's useful out of the various faith traditions in order to develop some type of super religion to defend freedom. We're not that. Most of us in our actual practice are Christians. I'm a Catholic Christian, um, but we're not the kind of shoppers of the faith, pick and choosing whatever's useful in order to defend our position. So at base, our principles at Acton, like myself, we fall in line with Christianity and Judaism by extension. So theologically and philosophically and anthropologically, we're in support of individual freedom and um, and this comes from a long tradition within the Judeo-Christian life. So we think in terms of other faith traditions, we find fairly good compatibility with Islam in the same Abrahamic tradition, as indeed we find other levels of compatibility in Eastern traditions, such as Buddhism. There's some level, it's not completely compatible, but there's at least some levels of compatibility. And even if there's some type of theistic version, kind of religious believing version of libertarianism, with a good God that creates mankind but leaves the sons and daughters of man free for their own personal development, then we fully embrace that too with very high compatibility. So, but we're not here just to debate about human action and human responsibility. We're also here to debate whether there is room for divine action and divine responsibility in terms of the arguments for freedom. So in our line of work, discussions about liberty are not just about one or the other, about the human side or the divine side. We just don't speak about the natural without speaking about the supernatural. So at Acton, our task is really to defend liberty from both points of view. It's quite a challenge, especially today. So this is the reality in which we see God essentially as the creator or the author of mankind, and he creates man with certain capacities, tendencies, and purposes, and God-given faculties, the most important of which is actually free will. So let's turn our attention to Christianity and to Rome, the eternal city from which I'm speaking to you tonight. And by the way, St. Peter's Basilica is just a few minutes walk from my office. So I pass by it every day and I'm reminded of why we're actually here. So in Rome, as you know, we have no shortage of religious believers. Rome is surely one of the most religious cities in the world, if not the most religious. It's considered the city where individual freedom, at least in the Italian tradition, is the most cherished and the most hotly defended. We found that during COVID that the city itself is a bunch of libertarian cats who like to do what they want and do as they please, and we're not going to take orders from big government. So, but there's some coincidence or some logic in why those who are firmly religious are also the first to firmly defend freedom. So Rome, as you know, is the heart and pulse of ancient Christianity. It has some 500,000 zealous professional male and female religious, what we like to call priests and nuns. And these are the kinds of Roman citizens, the people that live here, who are always eager to defend God-given human rights, and particularly the various freedoms associated with those rights. But that doesn't make any of them necessarily freedom fighters in the way that libertarians understand freedom. So let's make that clear. We're friends of freedom, but not necessarily the best friends. We'll get to that. I believe we could be better friends. So most Catholic Christians, as I said, are not staunch defenders of freedom in the way that libertarians and other liberals, true classical liberals, understand freedom. So they're not necessarily of the same socio-political economic liberalism, a worldview that errs on the side of a laissez-faire, unobstructed economic exchange, one with much fewer laws and regulations, one with much fewer barriers to movement, and as little as government as possible. Their zeal, this Christian zeal, is rather more about a freedom to worship and to exercise religious freedom to follow a certain level of conscience, of moral conscience in civil society. So the normal, let's say the normal Christian understanding of personal liberty is rather void of any economic and political translation. In fact, many professional clergy, the priests and nuns that live in Rome, at least the ones I know well, um, are actually fairly apolitical, and they're fairly wishy-washy. They're just not clear about what they think economically and politically. But they're happy to fight for freedom in a worship sense, in a conscience sense. And as Christ commanded, they're simply not of this world, quote unquote, of this world. So they have a view to living not in this life necessarily to the fullest, but in the eternal afterlife. And they live in another kingdom. You know, they're the type of people you said their heads in the clouds, they're literally in the clouds of heaven. So what about me? Well, I'm a born and raised Catholic Christian. I'm what they call a cradle Catholic. So my parents are Catholic, uh, and I really knew nothing else. You know, I've been Catholic my entire life. I've had my own metaphysical doubts, much like anyone, and I've had a very broad philosophical training in traditions well outside my faith. I've had enough training, you might say, to convince me otherwise of my own Christianity, really in a way to change my views, my basis, my convictions about the human person, about human society, and about the divine. So I'm very well read in Nietzsche. I'm very well read in Marx and Hegel and Marx and Karl Marx. I've read all the pagan and Eastern traditions. In the end, I fell in love with Aristotle. I fell in love particularly with the School of Salamanca. Many of you may be aware of the School of Salamanca. I fell in love with Austrian economics. And I also fell in love with Thomas Aquinas. I fell in love with different political views supported by Jacques Maritain, who was a believer in St. Thomas, a follower of St. Thomas. But above all, most especially of Friedrich von Hayek. So in terms of my political perspective, Jacques Maritain's Man in the State was a major inspiration, but even more so, the Road to Serfdom by von Hayek was a particular epiphany for me, a particular turning point in my life. So in my intellectual quest and journeying, what I do think, quite honestly and quite confidentially to you, friends of freedom listening tonight, is that I believe many philosophical traditions are compatible with Christianity. That's a blanket statement. I mean, they're compatible. They're not the same thing, but you know, Christianity is not just theology. Christianity is also natural reason, natural philosophy, and it's only normal that other intellectual traditions can follow that human reason, that human understanding. You know, we're built with the same DNA. So, but I think some philosophical traditions are much more compatible with Christianity, and others, by logic, less so. And of those that are highly compatible, perhaps the most compatible, I would say libertarianism, which I tend to advocate in my own professional work and my own political worldview. So there's no 100% antagonism between Christianity and libertarianism. In fact, I will argue that Christianity and libertarianism are allied belief systems and act as a valid, though not perfect, partnership for a functioning, free, and responsible society. What I can say is that I would prefer to call myself personally, if I have to take on two labels, two names, I would say I'm a libertarian Christian and not a Christian libertarian. Christian is my firmly inherited family name, and libertarianism is more like my personal name that adds value to my family patrimony. So I'll get to this distinction a little bit later at the very end of my talk, but just hold that in mind, that Christians are unswervingly Christian. If you have to die for something, you die for Christianity. You don't die as a libertarian. But I'm happy to call myself by a libertarian Christian, and that's okay. So anyways, in terms of my own upbringing, I remember my first introduction to the libertarian ethic was really through my own father, a Barry Goldwater libertarian-leaning politician from Arizona in the 1960s and 70s. I'm born in 1971. So I grew up in the very throngs of the high libertarian movement in Arizona with Barry Goldwater, who was running for president, I think, 3 times in that era. One day, I remember when I was about 17 years old, I was leading a charity drive around Christmas to collect toys and clothing for the poor children in downtown Phoenix, Arizona, my native city. And I appeared on the front page of the school newspaper. And I remember the headline was, quote unquote, Michael Severance, an example for Christian charity. And so you can imagine my vanity went through the roof, staring at myself at the front page as this saint. I'm not a saint, definitely not a saint. So anyways, I showed the newspaper to my father, and very, proud of myself, showed him, look, I'm doing great things. But I complained to my father that there was this scarcity. I'm speaking in like kind of economic terms. There's this scarcity of caring individuals willing to be freely charitable, willing to make sacrifices, give up their time and raise money or bring charitable items to the poor. So therefore, I concluded, since there's this scarcity of individuals who care, that the government needs to step up its care and do more in its management and creation of the welfare state. That is, this translates in, as you know, to tax more its citizen base in order to raise more money and to then redistribute to the poor in terms of some type of reallocation of monetary goods and other services. So my father was just livid. You can imagine, as a libertarian, steam coming out his ears, or just turning red with his blood boiling. So I remember my dad went into his library, picked up a book on one of his shelves, and just slammed it in my hands. And there it was, The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich von Hayek. Here I am, 17 years old, with zits on my face, not even really understanding life in general. But I read it. And I became passionate about the themes of the book. The lesson I learned in reading that book was that ceding my own and others' capacity for free-willed charitable action to that of a central government made of planners who are distant bureaucrats was a really dangerous proposition. Moreover, I realized that I was advocating for ever more coercion, a certain type of slavery, by advocating for a higher taxation and the growth of the welfare state. So after reading The Road to Serfdom, I realized that I didn't want people to be slaves, much less my own self. And I didn't want to delegate to some distant, uncaring overlord, because I wanted people to care. And neither should any of the other free citizens act this way or advocate this way. So the best society is actually to have free, caring citizens, not government-controlled servants. I realized that something that my own Christianity had already taught me, that what I can and what I should do by way of my own intelligence, my own freedom, my own desires for goodness, while taking care of my own self first, and then taking care of others, is quite compatible, if not perfectly compatible, with the political, social, economic, basic view that I wound up eventually adopting with libertarianism. So, but as I said, not all Christians are libertarian friendly, and vice versa. Not all libertarians are very Christian friendly. But I think we should get along. We should get along in a certain sort of brotherhood, at least. So now I'm going to come down to the core points of my talk. And the first is about Pope Francis, our leader in the Catholic Church, and his condemnation of libertarianism. So I'm going to speak about him first, and then kind of flesh out what he's trying to say, trying to explain the Pope, not spin the Pope, and then draw some conclusions of my own in the end. So bear with me. So I asked you to take Pope Francis as an example, not as a political thinker, but as a Catholic thinker. He's our leader. He's our president. But unfortunately, he's a man that neither likes libertarians, if very openly speaking, not a big fan of our think tank in Rome. He's not because we're known to be libertarians, where he just does not take our argument for a political and economic freedom quite seriously. So, but anyways, I remember back in 2017 when I was working, Pope Francis made headlines with a radical statement that sent my eyes popping, because this is the first time he actually spoke about libertarianism. And the citation of his statement comes from an opening statement he made at his own civil society think tank, which is called the Pontifical Academy for Social Sciences. Well, about 6 years ago, in his speech, he was underscoring some of his basic moral concerns about midway through his current pontificate. Pope Francis complained in these exact words: libertarian individualism is invading high levels of culture and education in both universities and schools. He says more, but I'll get to that in a second. But notice he says libertarianism is invading. It's like, a foreign aggressor, a foreign invader, taking over our sovereignty, getting on our nerves in a way. That's what he's saying. So when the Pope, who not only represents Roman Catholics, but in some way all Christians, speaks on morals, people listen. He's the number one soft power in the world. So it's kind of like, even if President Joe Biden, whether you like him or not, he's still considered the number one political representative in the world, whether you like him or not. But anyways, when Francis speaks, whether he says dumb things or smart things, people listen. So unfortunately, he spoke this way. So when Francis talked, he may speak erroneously, and people who are not free thinkers will take him literally and follow his condemnations in some type of loyal support. And this is wrong. So, but anyways, let's kind of dissect Francis, who he is as a person and what he's trying to say. So when Francis complained about libertarian individualism that invades education, then he goes on to say libertarianism exalts the selfish ideal whereby, this is quote unquote, it is only the individual who gives value to things and to interpersonal relationships, and where it is only the individual who decides what is truly good and what is truly bad. So he even goes further in his condemnation, saying this is a radical personal philosophy that detaches itself from all authority. So in any ways, we should ask the question, like, who is this guy talking? Well, first of all, he's the Pope. Secondly, he's a Jesuit. A Jesuit is a member of a certain congregation of priests who are highly intellectual, considered the most intellectual of all the Catholic priests. But Jesuits are known, like being professors, just making provocative statements, just saying stuff to shock us, to make us think. So perhaps he's doing that. I don't think so. I think he really is not a fan of libertarianism. But he is used to just making hard, frank statements. And we also remember he's Argentine. He's from Buenos Aires, and he was the archbishop of one of the most corrupt, most polluted, most crime-ridden, most economically and politically dysfunctional socialist capital cities in all of South America for many years. In this sense, and speaking about Buenos Aires, which means good air, there's really no good air to breathe. There's no healthy oxygen in terms of the political economic life in Buenos Aires. So he's kind of raised in this stench of filth and anti-freedom, corruption, monopoly, and so forth. And Francis is a chemist by training. He was a scientist long before becoming a priest. So his language can be very scientifically dry and unapologetically frank. And above all, Francis is a convinced Christian. Of course, he's the Pope. He's the type of Christian who seems particularly devoted to the social virtues of brotherhood. And this is a main point, which I'll make at the end. He's very convinced that we are all truly brothers. You can say what you want about Pope Francis, and he may condemn a libertarian believer, but he'll be the first to help that brother of his in any way he can. So he's the type of person who, as a Christian, he has this kind of joyous, self-sacrificing love. He cares about the earth. He cares about his fellow brothers, fellow citizens of the earth. He's very earthly in that sense, both literally and figuratively. So Francis is not a bad guy. Don't just write him off as the arch nemesis of libertarianism. He's just confused, might say. He might not understand what the libertarian is really like. But anyways, that's Pope Francis in a nutshell. It's kind of a cartoon character of him. But what is he really trying to say? Really four things. He's talking about individualism on one hand. He's talking about libertarianism on another hand. Then he's talking about the selfish ideal. And then he's talking about this thing called judgment, moral judgment, about what is good and bad, about right and wrong. So there's a lot to say, and there's a lot to dissect here in what he's trying to say. He's not against the individual and personal freedom per se, but he is against selfishness. I think we're all against selfishness. And he's against placing the entire burden of moral authority on our own personal, private decisions about right and wrong. And maybe perhaps this is a relief, because no one is the true authority of right and wrong. For him, the source of right and wrong does not fall on the individual, doesn't befall the individual, but really comes from God as the source of the truth of the right and the wrong. So perhaps this is a relief for all of us who are trying to advocate some type of morality. But anyways, let's flesh out his terms a bit. By individualism, let's start with this. By individualism, Pope Francis means not necessarily individual uniqueness, individual preferences, individual ambitions, individual choices. Libertarians get this, okay? This is all very good and actually very permissible according to the Christian ethic, which according to the concept of human dignity, which means we're all born in the image and likeness of God, one of the things that we get is that we're all unique individuals, all with unique gifts, all with unique characteristics, all with unique missions in life. Individuals and individuality are fundamental. They're part and parcel of the Christian vision. Francis is really criticizing the ism here, not individual, but ism. ISM, the ism that's attached to the word individual. What makes the word individual sound more like an ideology. Okay, so if I'm speaking to Pope Francis in the room, this is what he's thinking. For Francis, so it is as if the individual was what ultimately matters in the totality of the cosmos, in the totality of our moral, anthropological, civil ideals. This is because Christianity sees the person as not just an individual, but simultaneously social, as independent on others, but oddly enough, completely dependent on others, and above all, dependent on God. And that's a happy relationship, to be both independent and dependent. So we're individual and social at the same time. Now, in terms of the selfish ideal, this is a term that logically flows for Francis from individualism. This is a philosophy for Francis that exalts the individual and tends towards a self-centered existence. This is what he says. The Christian philosophy is orientated towards the common good, he says, which often requires single persons to deny what is good for them individually in order to bring about the higher good, the higher order, which is to say, the flourishing of the entire human community. Hence, a good example is often taken from environmental ethics, where in theory it is poorly seen or considered sinful in the Christian sense that a maker of car batteries, just as an example, a banal example, or of anything toxic with toxic waste that is disposed, for example, near an agricultural center, simply because it's cheaper, faster, and more economically advantageous to the manufacturer, but is destructive to the criticism of judgment of what is good and bad. He puts, for him, if he's trying to kill libertarianism, he puts the nail in the coffin of libertarianism by saying that no one is the ultimate source of judging what is good and bad. Only God is the true judge of what is good and bad. Okay, and so, and above all, in terms of this understanding what is good and bad, Pope Francis is the leader of a church. What does a church mean? A church means an assembly. A church means a community. It's like a parliament in a way. A church is, above all, it's assembly. It's a gathering of people. And for over 2,000 years, the Christianity has been convening councils, synods, world meetings to rationalize together about the good and bad in terms of the particular prudential application of either good principles or protection against evil. So even the Pope himself doesn't see himself as a singular moral authority dictating to others what is necessarily good or bad, even if the reputation of some popes in the past has been particularly anti-conciliar, anti-ecclesial, anti-assembly, and more dictatorial than others. So for Francis, it is coming to the last term, libertarianism, his problem, again, resides not with the root word of liberty, per se. The church is a great fan of liberty. But like with the word individual, he's a bit bothered by the ism attached to liberty. Hence, for Francis, anything with an ism is a sort of another ideology, another kind of micro belief that's exalted in a higher sense than it deserves. So it's not like the individual is the ultimate source of reality, but neither is our freedom the ultimate source of happiness and flourishing. It's not a sacrosanct end in itself. So as our own libertarian-inspired founder at the Acton Institute, a priest, Father Robert Sirico, said when criticizing Pope Francis's criticism, he says, any ethical system that sees freedom in the sense of an absence of constraint, a total absence of constraint, as in freedom from something, as its own end and finality, Christians can't accept this. And for Catholics and other Christians, liberty is much more than just a negative freedom. It's more used as a means to an end and not an end in itself. So, and even Lord Acton, who our namesake is at the Acton Institute, admonishes that our freedom is about willing and choosing and acting that for which we should do. And this is another problem with libertarianism that Christians may have with certain schools of libertarianism, that freedom of above all is attached to some type of moral ought, some type of moral presumption, some type of moral principle that we should all accept, like we don't kill each other, we don't steal from each other, or we shouldn't harm each other, we shouldn't coerce each other against our wills necessarily. These are the shoulds and oughts that are attached to freedom. So I don't think any of us, even amongst the schools of libertarian, are so radical in our belief in freedom that we can do anything we want. There's some limitation. There's some simple limitation. And this is a type of golden rule that Christianity and libertarians tend to accept, that I'm free to choose what I want so long it doesn't kill or seriously harm anyone else. It's like the no harm, no foul principle approach of libertarianism. So this is a good point of transition in my talk here. I have about 10 minutes left. And now the time is to look at libertarianism in some type of friendly relationship, or more than friendly relationship, that it can have with Christianity. So this discussion about the golden rule, the Christian golden rule, is a good point of transition to discuss whether or not Christianity and libertarianism are indeed highly compatible in their basis of understanding of personal liberty. So perhaps they should have more in common, more friendship, more brotherhood than Pope Francis actually concedes. This is my hunch. And much more than most Christians think. So let's look at other forms of constraint and coercion that both Christians and libertarians normally speak about and can normally consider themselves as allies. Well, the first thing is about the limited state. So there's this notion of the limited state. Well, some libertarians who follow Rothbard's kind of anarchic tendency towards no state whatsoever believe that even a limited state is too much constraint on individual freedom. Well, you won't find Christians advocating for anarchy. They simply don't go that far, but they do argue for a very limited state, like a very tiny state, something that's very far and distant, just leaves me alone as an adult in my own free decisions. Even Jesus himself, we know, kind of played this game. He respected the Roman overlords, advising his disciples to render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is to God's, recognizing that there's really no escaping earthly political regime, just as much as there's no escaping any kind of celestial governance. For Christians, the state is limited not because of any particular political grievance or bias, but listen to this. Christians, we like living in the states because we believe that, in essence, man is not just intelligent, but he's limited in his intelligence. Now, that's a qualification that Christians are humbly willing to admit. We're intelligent, but very limited in our intelligence. So Christians believe themselves that man's power, as Pope Leo XIII said back in the 18th century, condemning communism and its central planning and its struggle with the knowledge problem. He says man's powers, like his intellectual powers, his powers of freedom, and his general nature, are limited. And therefore, to go beyond that limit, he cannot go, even in his creation of government systems. This is the Pope in the late 1900s, or sorry, late 1800s, explaining that we have to limit man in all his capacity, in all his endeavors, because he's not perfect. So to have a grandiose state that is omnipotent, that is all powerful in its decision making and affecting the lives of citizens, falls prey to the same exact imperfections and messes that all of us as individuals fall into. So for Christians, it's best to limit the state's power, turning it into something with much more controls by the free citizens, much more checked by the other authorities, much more balanced in its overall power, especially against error and corruption. So this was the Christian-inspired federal republic model that the United States and many other Western countries eventually adopted from the advent of the neoclassical liberal model in the 18th century, with constitutions that tend to curb and protect against big government. In the New Testament, there are very few fists raised actually at government. They're not like, get rid of the enemy and kill it, and we'll find our own micro communities, even under the Roman persecution. So what they did raise their fists at were this kind of utopian spirit that we can create heaven on earth. Because as Christ, the founder of Christianity, said, your kingdom is not of this world. Don't worry about all the messes here. Don't try and make life perfect in this world. What you truly are citizens of is the kingdom of heaven. If you want to be servants of anything, serve heaven and rather than earthly powers. So the Christians had never sought this kind of collectivist utopian ideal because, one, it's not possible in terms of our intelligence and planning, and because we know we're not going to stay for very long. We're going to move on and spend an eternity elsewhere under different government. So there's not this ambition to create this big government, perfect society. So Christians in brief believe man is imperfect, he's fallen, he's good, but he's potentially evil. So don't give him a lot of power. His ruling over men potentially is evil and messy. Give more authority to God, follow his commands, and freely choose to follow his commands. And if you're going to have rule on this earth, it's a sort of representative, delegated authority. We're never going to fall into this love of power because even our own power is not ours. And so our approach to governance is to limit it because it's imperfect, because we really don't have the power, and because it's delegated. In the end, we don't really care because we're going to move on eventually after 85 years on average, at least in Italy. Now, in terms of the principle of subsidiarity, this is a great thing. This is actually my favorite principle within Catholic Christianity in terms of creating a more limited state. So Catholic Christians have always vouched for this principle that they call subsidiarity. And this is a principle of problem solving that essentially says local problems, local solutions. Local problems, local know-how. So the big problems, say about dysfunctional authority or poverty or whatever, these problems are best addressed by local people that know the problem the best, that live closest to it, and are willing to spend time with personal responsibility, especially in a private sphere, personal responsibility in solving that problem. So the principle of subsidiarity keeps us in check against, above all, referring our problems to the government, because we have to take personal responsibility. And above all, it's a check against some type of distant federal or national power that will look at the problem in a very bureaucratic, cold, uncaring fashion. Exactly the type of government that I was naively advocating as a 17-year-old asking for more welfare. Well, Christians don't want that. The Christian call is that you personally are going to take care of your neighbor in your own freedom, and no government overlords are going to tell you what to do because they don't even know what to do. You know what to do. So you take personal responsibility. In our tradition at the Acton Institute, we were especially inspired by Lord Acton, who, as a Catholic and a passionate advocate of this principle of subsidiarity, argued, one, for limiting the power of all earthly powers. And that included the Pope. As a Catholic, he said the Pope shouldn't have so much government authority. And we all know his statement about that. He said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And advocating for subsidiarity says, don't give so much power to the state because they're just going to fall in love with that. They're going to become vain, like I was as a 17-year-old advocating for more government power. And if I become that government overlord or bureaucrat, I'm going to think of myself as God. I'm going to think of myself as this almighty power that can solve people's problems. Well, Catholics don't want that. Christians don't want that. The Christian moniker is individual responsibility and personal responsibility. So in this advocacy for dismantling, say, political power, Lord Acton advocated for the dismantling of the whole imperial regime in Great Britain. As an English Catholic, he says, no one needs to be subject to a crown, especially a distant crown. And everyone is their own prince. And this is the Christian model. If you're the son of the king of the universe, you are a prince. You live a princely life, you live a noble life, and you have your own little kingdom to manage. So this kind of dismantling of this supranational state, this imperial state, is very much in line with the Christian political philosophy. Now, turning to the real heart of our discussion about the freedom to choose. The freedom to choose. Now, this is where we find the real nexus between Christians and libertarians. This fundamental freedom to choose. My choice. All I'm saying, this is my choice. I'm free to do what I want to do. And I think we already get the gist where Christianity is pushing towards personal freedom, personal responsibility. So in the state and personal liberty model, we understand that in Christianity, the zeal is really for a moral care, and you can't have a moral care, some type of charity, some type of love, without actually doing it yourself. If the state does that for you, it holds your hand to hold someone else's hand. That's a form of coercion or a form of manipulation. The Christian moniker calls for radical personal responsibility, a deeply committed hand-holding from you to your neighbor to help them flourish. It demands of that, and it demands of that in terms of God's judgment of whether you lived actually a good or bad life. So I think we all understand that. So maximizing this freedom of choice in the Christian worldview, it's actually maximizing my ability to become a lover and helper of my neighbor. And this is a radical call for love, but at the same time, a radical call for personal, individual, intelligent, subsidiarity responsibility towards helping our neighbor to live a better life. Perhaps libertarians might understand that it's just, I'm free because I'm free. Well, the Christians would have an issue with that. It's not a freedom just to become free. It's actually a freedom to help and to love. Our whole basis of freedom and making a free choice is not just about myself. It's not just about self-care. Of course, Christianity says you can't love your neighbor without first loving yourself. So, of course, in my first choices, I'm taking care of myself, but so that I then can become capacitated to love another. So I must make choices for myself, take care of myself, look after myself, my own self-interest. That's perfectly normal, but it can't stop there. There's a call within Christianity then to become social. As we said in the beginning of my talk, that the Christian paradox is that we're social and individuals simultaneously all the time. And so that's a tension that the Christians have trouble with, become perhaps selfish, according to Pope Francis and other Christian pastors. But it's a certain type of self-care that we're focusing on in order to then take care of others. So in my conclusion, there are these so-called tensions between the two. Let's just call them tensions. They're like, they're trying to pull each other apart, and they should be pulling each other apart, but they should be more shaking hands. They should be more hand-holding between whether I am libertarian or whether I'm Christian. There shouldn't be tensions. There should be more hand-holding, more handshaking between the two. So I might call myself a libertarian Christian, emphasizing an allegiance to libertarianism as a helpful illumination of my core, unswerving basis of freedom, which is Christianity, which I will not deny, which I will die for. Or I might call myself a Christian libertarian, where Christianity is useful to illuminate my libertarianism, which I'm not willing to deny and perhaps willing to die for. So when push comes to shove, if we really have to choose one label or the other, what I would die for, not what I would defend until the death, that's up to you. In my own worldview, I'm a libertarian Christian. Christian is my family name. I'm not willing to abandon my family. I will fight for both, and I will personally do both. I'm personally and professionally, I'm still doing both. So I'll end with this, with a quote from a true libertarian Christian by the name of Jacqueline Isaacs, who co-authored the book A Call to Freedom: Why You Can't Be Both Christian and Libertarian. Jacqueline Isaacs says, while this may be an oversimplification, when traditional Christian values and individual liberty come into tension in our political conversations, conservative Christians tend to default towards protecting values and morals, while libertarians tend to default towards just protecting liberty. So she goes on to say that this is an example, while some of us tend to defend liberty as the first value, and some of us tend to defend morals as a primary basis for values, we're called to do both. It's not an either or, but a both and. She says, we believe that Christians should aim to protect and conserve both values and liberty. And this is what really Francis is talking about, that it's a call to arms for both. It's a call for a true partnership. And what he argued for in his last social encyclical, it's a call to become all brothers, is fratelli tutti, that there is this brotherhood between allied traditions and faiths. And there's a particular close brotherhood between libertarianism and Christianity. It's not an identical brother. We're not identical twins, identical brothers, but there's a very close compatibility that in terms of use and in terms of unswerving loyalty. And with that, I'll end the discussion and open up to questions and answers. Thank you.
Michael, thank you so much. That was lovely talk. I love what you guys are doing at Acton Institute. Thank you so much for your hard work. And if we still have a couple of minutes, we might ask some questions from the chat. Guys, thank you so much for all the questions you submitted. Okay, let's start from a tricky one, right? Submitted by Sarah. Dear Michael, do you think that Jesus was the first libertarian?
I love that question. Usually in Rome, you get the question, do you think Jesus was the first socialist? No, Jesus was God. Jesus is the only person who would say, I am God, and that's all I am. But if you had to ask Jesus for a political opinion, he would lean towards libertarianism, I think, because he believes, just like his apostles, he called them, he asked them, he invited them. and he spent time with people with radical personal and political views other than his own, and he respected people in terms of their choices. So yes, I mean, God can't have a political label attached to him, but yes, if he had to choose some type of earthly label, sure, perhaps a libertarian. I'm not quite even sure the first, because I think the sensitivity to freedom and as much personal freedom as we can possibly have is perhaps predates Jesus, perhaps more in a more hedonic movement and the more kind of pleasure-seeking models, and perhaps these are the more faulty models of libertarianism. I do think that Christianity is the greatest protector of libertarianism, because it's the one faith tradition that puts radical responsibility on the individual. But it's a call to love. It's a call to self-love above all, and then I can love others. So we have that in common. We like self-interest. We like taking care of ourselves. Then we can take care of others.
Thank you so much. We have another question submitted by Robert. Michael, how can churches serve as examples of charitable voluntary organizations that show how humans can organize and care for each other without the need of statist compulsion?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, particularly within the European churches, you know, the churches, especially like at the local parish or within a national level, you have a council of bishops who advocate for charity, and there's kind of these Vatican supranational agencies that called Catholic Charities or Caritas Internationalis. You know, they take a lot of government aid. And so they're the first sort of hypocrites, and that they are taking coerced money and use it in their own private charity. So state aid, taking taxes and redistributing it. But they also do a lot of fundraising itself. What the church can do better would be to exactly create this mesh of kind of libertarian thinking towards individual responsibility, and mesh it with the Christian understanding, the theological understanding of love. So the church has to do a much better job of actually preaching wealth creation. And that wealth creation is never at heart a sign of greed. It's actually a sign of care for the community. That in creating wealth, above all, we're alleviating poverty. In alleviating poverty, we have a lot less need for the standard types of charity, and we can focus on other types of charity that are much more important. Charity is not just about giving money to people or giving people clothes like I was doing at 17, or toys. Charity is also friendship. It's spending time with people that are not begging on the streets, helping them with their personal problems, their personal issues. That's charity. Charity is walking with others as they're having problems. As we learned during COVID, we had to show a lot of charity and just sticking with people who are having issues. That's charity. So I also think the church needs to up the intellectual discussion of what love is. Love is not just giving a poor boy a toy or a beggar 20 euro. Charity is a much bigger discussion. And it also, in terms of actually financial alleviation, it's much better to work on the positive solution, like how to create more wealth, as opposed to keep people that are poor happy. I don't know if I have answered your question, but I think that's.
Thank you so much.
Those are the type of discussions we have in Rome.
Right, and it's rather a long discussion. Okay, let's try to ask another interesting question submitted by Laura. Michael, we Christians use theological arguments to defend the unborn rights. How to use a libertarian, more rational argument to anchor our defense for innocent lives?
Well, yeah, that's a hot issue. But if we, I think libertarians in a way can argue against abortion, the right to life, much better than Christians if there's this radical autonomy between life forms, with the mother as a life form and the nascent human life form growing inside the woman. That's radical autonomy. So the no tread on me philosophy, no harm principle, then you have to ultimately protect that life. In my own defense against the death sentence, I've wavered my whole life, be it against the capital punishment. But I'm ultimately now in my 50s radically against the death penalty, because I think you have to be consistent on all ways. If we have to respect human life in terms of our ultimate authority of snuffing it out or keeping it into existence, it's much better to keep it into existence. Now, the potential issue, for example, one of the reasons why we want to keep it into existence, because every individual has potential to become great. So a life in the womb has a potential to become great. And even a serial killer in prison has the potential to become great. There could be some type of reform, some type of hope. But I think in terms of the radical autonomy, then leaves credence that no one has the authority, just as Pope Francis was saying, no individual has the moral authority to really deem what is ultimately good or bad. So it's kind of a no hands-off approach, and I think the libertarian has a key advantage in that case. Just leave people alone, and leave the little cells growing in the body alone too, because that's a person too.
Thank you so much. Okay, do we still have some time, Michael? How are we doing with your time?
Yeah, we have time. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, let's try to ask another question submitted by Allison. Do you think free will can be a start of or a part of the basis between libertarians and Christians? Free will is what God left to us.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It is the basis. So Allison, who asked that question, it is the basis. I mean, you can almost say, Christians will say, well, you can't have God without freedom, because take God out of the equation. There is nothing in existence. Okay, from an ontological point of view, in terms of existence, no God, nothing. Not even freedoms or rights or T-shirts or ties or coconuts or even Zoom exists or internet. So no God, nothing. Okay, fine. So God is the ultimate basis in terms of ontology, in terms of existence. But in terms of the moral basis, yeah, free will is everything. It's will, and will, part of the will is also desire. I mean, this is one of the discussions or tenets of free will that's taken out of the discussion, that our freedom to will something. I think we understand in Italian, like when we say I love you, you say ti voglio bene. I say, Allison, ti voglio bene. If I say that to Allison, it says, I will your good. I will Allison's good. So my love for Allison is a desire for Allison's good. I want Allison to be a good person. I want her to flourish. I want her to be happy. And everything that I will for her in my action is for Allison's good in a love sense. So there is a basis in free will, but we have to remember that free will is also attached to our desires for the good life, our own good life. I want to love myself. I'm not going to kill myself. And part of my free will is to keep myself in existence. And so deeply philosophically, these are the issues I love, that I'm passionate about, is that our freedom for freedom's sake is nothing. Our freedom for the sake of goodness is everything. So even more so on the deeply anthropological level, it's more about the desire for the good, the desire for happiness.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If I just might briefly ask you about the picture that stands right next to you. I have to tell you, this is one of my favorite pictures ever. Two heroes of liberty.
Yeah, you tell us, Sebastian. Who is this?
So we can see Friedrich von Hayek, and we can see Saint John Paul II, the Pope. Actually, there is a common belief. I come from Poland, which is also a country of origin of John Paul II, and there is a common belief that our Pope was a free marketer. He was really advocating. So is that really the case? Like, you as an expert in both fields, can you confirm that John Paul II was actually into free markets and individualism?
Well, absolutely. I mean, John Paul II's vision of the market was the very inspiration of our institute, and the fact that he can have a brotherhood with Friedrich von Hayek, who was, a nominal Christian, you might say, is the perfect reason. I mean, this is the whole. I keep this on my desk because it inspires me to work every day. That the libertarian philosophy, and also in the Austrian economic tradition, is not perfectly compatible with Christianity, but it's very, very highly compatible. Very, very high, and it has a good working relationship, and they had a true friendship, and they truly admired each other. You know why John Paul II was a market advocate, Sebastian? You know why? Can you?
Like, I guess he was raised seeing all the horrible things happening during the World War II. He also was aware of the communist regime happening in Poland. So there's more to that for sure.
No, because one, there's a certain level of poverty that's simply not good for our daily bread. When we pray the Our Father every day as Christians, we say, "Our Father who art in heaven, give us this day our daily bread." Okay, hey, we aren't getting our daily bread. Where's our Father? So it's fundamental. It's fundamental as Christian believers to be well, to have that daily bread. Now, if you cede that power to some type of government God who's not delivering on the daily bread, Christianity is a very hard sell, because you think that there's no wealth, no God. Okay, so that's one main reason. But above all, within the market tradition, it's the ability to freely choose and follow a career path. So particularly within the Christian tradition, we're always on mission. We want to follow a calling, a vocation. We believe as Christians that God has created each of us so uniquely, so specially planned, so executively made, that he's asking us to do something very particular. And only in a market economy does the invisible hand, let's say this invisible hand of God, allows people to try out and do different things and fall and eventually succeed by following what you ultimately desire for yourself and your professional vocation. I mean, like, even my own self, here I am in Rome after 23 years. I never imagined that I would be here and so fulfilled working a very specific vocation, a stone's throw from the Vatican. My plan was completely different. I wanted to become a biologist. I studied science like Pope Francis. I wanted to become part of the Human Genome Mapping Project. Those were my ambitions. And then my heart was, set on fire by really Friedrich von Hayek. He's my mate, much more than the Pope. And I believe that, we needed to, the DNA of human person was much more about values, about principles. What were really built into the core of the human person was more about freedom and care and concern about this common teamwork, working towards human happiness and in freedom. So it's really Hayek here that sets us on fire in terms of our quest for freedom, and his advocacy of the market is perfectly in line with even the Pope's worldview at the time in the 1990s. It's the market is absolutely valued for providing a basic level of well-being, and above all, searching for your happiness within total freedom, as much freedom as possible within the market. There you go. Put him back in the background.
Thank you so much for this amazing answer. So let's ask one last question for today. The question was submitted by Israr. What is the major hurdle to Christians professing libertarianism? So, like, what's the toughest sell? How would you?
Yeah, ignorance. I think, there's the good book. We read the Bible, Christians in general. Thankfully, Catholics aren't very good at reading the Bible in this sense. I mean, we're much more natural philosophers as Catholics. We believe in a broad tradition of the intellect, and there's an inherited tradition. And, that's what the word Catholic means. Catholic means everything. So we're naturally looking for truth in other traditions, and that the Catholic Christianity is a coalition of ideas, a brotherhood of ideas. And a lot of Christians simply can't step outside their own Christianity. In a way, it's a kind of fatal conceit, as maybe Friedrich Hayek might say, that they believe that all the answers are within Christianity, and they're really not. They're really not. So Christians can discover and admire and understand libertarianism by putting the good book aside and just studying what is good for the human person in a very naturalistic, rational understanding of the person. And that's perfectly fine. Catholic Christians have always been quite good at that. Perhaps there's only been the dumbing down of, say, Catholic education in the last 30 years. For some reason or the other, perhaps it's the advance of the slow march of Marxism within the institutions of education that's sped up the death of kind of the truly Catholic natural approach to understanding freedom and our basic responsibilities.
Michael, thank you so much. That was a very enlightening session. Thank you to all the students who've been with us. We will see each other next Wednesday, where we'll talk about liberty as an Islamic value. So actually, we will try to learn more about that. Michael, thank you so much for your talk. Once again, guys, make sure to check out acton.com and learn about the Acton Institute. And once again, Michael, thank you so much, and thanks to all the students who have been with us here today, guys.
Yeah, just one last word. Remember that we're the Acton Institute, not the Action Institute. That may be like the Von Mises Institute, which is not. It's not a bad mistake, but we're Acton, Lord Acton, as in power corrupts. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Thank you so much, and see you during the another session. Thank you so much, guys.
Everybody, good day, good evening, and good night.